trying to think of an Alaska song. Only one I can think of is from the movie North to Alaska.
That's
You know,
right.
you go north to Alaska, you go north, the rush is on, way up north,
That's right.
north to Alaska. Do you know,
It was the
Mark? I
same.
know you
It was
got
the
that.
same guy who sang "Battle of New Orleans." What was his name?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, what to think of
yeah,
that? If you know it, call in right now.
yeah. That's 888-654-3285. Yes. No, that I better not get that number. No telling what that number is. Mark, welcome. At least as we're recording, welcome back from Alaska. You
Thank
have a
you.
good time.
Yeah, I had 4 days in the beautiful state of Alaska and got to meet a lot of pastors and travel a lot of country and see some beautiful land. And yeah, it's great, beautiful place. Love it up there.
Where were you?
Well, Anchorage, and then we went to Wasilla, and then we went down the Kenai Peninsula and spent some time on the Kenai Peninsula and saw some of the churches, met some of the pastors there. And hey, if you're interested in moving to Alaska, there are a lot of churches that need pastors in Alaska. There really are.
That's
And
great.
yeah, good
That is
place.
great. Been there 3 times. Every time, different spot, a lot of beauty, but never been to the peninsula. That
Yeah,
sounds like that would be a lot of fun.
it
A
was.
lot of fun. We're going to talk about 9 fears in church revitalization, turning it into a 3-part series over 3 weeks. And we got 9 of them. So basically, Mark, we're covering 3 at a time. These particular 9 come from our community at Church Answers. And, you know, asking the question, what's stopping you from getting involved in church revitalization? Or what are some of the challenges and fears you have if you are in a church revitalization? And they came back, and these are, I didn't tally them, so they're not in any particular order, but these are the most frequent responses. And my guess is whether it's Mondays with Mark, that it's not always on Mondays, but usually it's on Mondays. If he's not going to Alaska, he'll have it somewhat, but usually Mondays with Mark. And all of your interaction, you hear these things all the time. So let's get right into them. The first one is the fear of failure. Failure is a big word, and it can cover a lot of things. What are you hearing, Mark, about failure? You know, what is it? Is it failure that the church ain't going to make it? Is it failure that I don't have the skills? We'll talk about that later. But what are some of the failures you hear?
Well, I think sometimes it's a failure financially. What happens if I move my family there and the church doesn't make it? A lot of times the church is on a pretty slim financial footing anyway, and they agree to pay you a certain amount of money, and you realize that unless the church grows or some things happen, they're not going to be able to do that for a very long period of time. And so there's a failure of being able to take care of my family and meet the needs I have with my family. That seems to be really weighing heavy on guys a lot. That's sometimes the first thing they say when they talk to me and they're afraid of failure is that, you know, they're not going to be able to pay me in the next 6 months if things don't change. And I've got a mortgage to pay and I've got kids I got to take care of and we've got hospital insurance and all that kind of thing. So that's one thing. And the other thing is just the sense that I don't want to be the one that has to shut this church down. I don't want to be the one that comes here and I'm the one that's got to turn off the lights and lock the door and walk away and remember that for the rest of my ministry that, yeah, I shut down a church. Those two things I think really weigh heavily on guys. There are other things, but I think those are the two main I hear most of the time.
And we'll cover this a little bit more in another one, but I still want you to address it. The fear of my family not being happy, not the financial side, but just the whole adjustment issue. My spouse, my kids, take them, and I've made all these promises to them. It's going to be great. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but they're not happy.
Yeah, it's not what we expected, right? We don't have necessarily a loving congregation that's enjoying what we're doing and following our leadership. We actually are sometimes pastoring people who don't want to be around us, who don't like what we're doing. It seems like every step we take, we're trying to correct things and make them better, and people are pushing against us, and the family gets worn down on that. Sometimes we can get in sort of a warrior mode, not in a, I don't mean in a bad way, but I just mean, you know, battling for the truth, battling for the church. We as pastors can get in a warrior mode and realize, okay, for the next 2 or 3 years, we're just going to have to really battle some stuff in order to get through and see some daylight. But your family, they may not want to be in a warrior mode. You know, they want to
Yeah.
be in a place where they're loved and cared for and where they're growing spiritually. And they don't like showing up at church and having people give them the, you know, the stink eye because they don't like what's going on. They don't like their children being the only kids in the preschool or only kids in the youth group. So yeah, you're a fear of that your family's not going to be happy and not be feel like they're able to plug in, and this is something where they're growing as well. And that's one of the reasons when we talk about church revitalization in terms of a spouse, you got to have really spousal perseverance, not just cooperation. I mean, when you're planting a church, we
Yeah, yeah,
say, "Hey, I'm cooperating.
good word.
I'm going along for the ride," but but in a revitalization or a replant, it's perseverance. It's like, "Hey, I'm here for the long haul. It's going to be hard before it gets easy, and then it's going to get even harder." But there is that fear of what it's going to do to my family, and absolutely, completely. And you go
Oh,
back and look. You go back and you read Henry Blackaby's original stuff on experiencing God. When he went to Faith Baptist in Saskatoon, people told him, "Look, the church isn't going to be able to pay you because they're not going to have enough money. Secondly, you're uprooting your family from California. You're taking them up there, and you're not going to be able to provide for them. All those things." And he didn't have any fear in all of that because he was confident God called him there. But those are very common fears that we hear all the time, and they make sense. The reality that is out there is real, but at the same time, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but the risen Christ is real too, and He's able to meet every need that we could ever have, and we have to battle our fears that way. But those are legitimate fears that guys often have.
I coached a guy for quite a while who was in a tough revitalization. And it was so difficult that the first thing that happened was his three kids said, "We're not going to church here anymore."
Yeah,
So they started going to another church in town. Teenagers at the time, middle school and high schoolers. And so started going to another church in town. Within 3 or 4 months, the wife said, "I'm not going to church here anymore," because she started getting attacked. That might be a sign that, these fears have been realized.
yeah, that might be, and they are realized at times. And in previous podcasts, we have suggested that on some occasions it's a good idea to find another church nearby that can minister to your family, your children, your wife, and those kinds of things. But those are legitimate fears. Um,
If,
Also, I
if,
think
you, if you can get away with the other church.
that's true if you can. And I also think sometimes just the fear of, and this is kind of a human thing, but nobody wants to be unsuccessful, right? You don't want to go to a place and
Right.
it go down. And you realize if we're going to revitalize, we may lose people before we gain people. We're going to have some really lean years. And some guys just, the fear that I'm going to be categorized as a guy who can't grow a church, can't lead a church. And some guys are somewhat insecure anyway. And so the fear of that is really very real in that kind of
Is
failure.
kind of a parenthetical question before we go to the next point. Is there somewhat a fantasy type view of revitalization for some pastors or would be pastors? It seems like the cool thing to do right now. I mean, revitalization is back in, and so they really are not prepared for some of these fears that they might should have.
Well, we spend the majority of our time on our team trying to prepare them for those fears, but you're absolutely right. It's kind of the flavor of the month right now. We want to go do a revitalization. I heard these great stories. I've read these great books and how these churches have turned around, and I want to be part of that. And well, it's a lot of work and it's a lot of spiritual warfare, and it costs you a lot and it costs your family a lot. And success is not necessarily guaranteed the way we see it on this side of heaven. Let me just say really quickly here, God may have a failure in your future because He's got to edify you. He's got to prepare you for something else. And you may go to a place and it may look like a failure in the first 5 or 6 years, or it may look like a failure in your life. But when you get to heaven, you're going to see that it really wasn't a failure. God was doing something in that church and something in you, something in your family that was really important. So, Dr. Rayner, we got to be real careful how we couch success and how we couch failure. And so, yeah, but absolutely, you're spot on with that.
Well, that's a good segue to the second point. That's a fear of comparisons. You said we got to be real careful how we couch success. Let's think about some of the comparisons that are out there: comparison with other churches, comparison with other pastors, comparison within a denomination, comparison with facilities, comparison with types of church members you have. There are a lot of comparisons that are out there, and some of these would be revitalization leaders are saying, well, I don't know if I want to go up against them, or they may be and saying going up against them is telling in itself, and they may be in a revitalization and said, I had no idea I would be so angry at the large church that is a half a mile from our church.
And that does happen because you look at that larger church and they have all the music resources and all the children's resources and all the great campus resources and finances to do things. And here you are trying to figure out how to change the filter on the furnace, and your wife's taking care of the kids in the nursery, and you got no one to lead music, and you can become resentful. You shouldn't be, but you can be. And then the comparison constantly: is there something wrong with me? Why am I in this situation? Pastoring a church of 15 people that some of them, half of them, don't like me, and a church that's really declining. Whereas some guys I went to seminary with are, they're doing great. Church plant that's doing great, or they're in a large church and they're moving to a bigger church and getting more of a platform. There's really nothing to be gained by comparing yourself to another person in ministry. God's called you to that place for that time and that purpose, and you've just got to be obedient in the field that He's placed you. But man, it's always been hard, Dr. Rayner, not to compare ourselves. But when you've got Twitter and Facebook and you see every Sunday guys posting stuff, we're coming up on Easter, and there are going to be guys posting
Oh,
stuff about, well, actually, I'm ahead of myself because, as we record this, all right, we're coming up on
it'll be
Easter.
it'll be after Easter.
Right. So it made this past Easter. If you recall, this past Easter, there were lots of guys posting stuff about Easter egg hunts with like 50,000 kids, and the Easter eggs were dropped from helicopters and stuff like that. And you're out there trying to do an Easter egg hunt for your neighborhood, and you get, 20 kids, or you don't have an Easter egg hunt, anything like that. Other times, guys will say, "Hey, we had to add extra service on Easter Sunday." And meanwhile, you've got mostly older people, and on Easter Sunday, they go to be with their grandkids at their church, and you actually don't have any visitors, and you're actually down on Easter Sunday. And so those kinds of comparisons are hard to ignore because you see them on social media, and the adversary really drills down on us and say, well, this is because you're just kind of a lazy, lame pastor. You're not really worth anything. And we begin to think like that. I live out here in Kansas, and one of my favorite presidents is Dwight Eisenhower. In fact,
I thought you were going to say Truman.
I like Truman. Truman was a Southern Baptist. Truman's from Missouri, and he was a Southern Baptist. But they're both good. They're both really good. That's a whole other podcast for a whole other day. Those two guys, how they didn't really get along, and they grew up 200 miles from each other. But anyway, I even have an Eisenhower license plate. You can get a special license plate here in Kansas that says "I like Ike," and so I have
Oh, that was his presidential motto.
I know.
That was his campaign motto.
But one of his many famous sayings was that pessimism never won a battle. And I mean, if we can become pessimistic all the time about ourselves and comparing ourselves to others, and our church doesn't have what other churches have, we're never going to win anything. And so comparison is not helpful. But boy, it is a fear of comparing yourself. And look, full transparency here, man. I'm at Warnell Road Baptist Church in Kansas City. You've heard me talk about it ad nauseum, but it seated 610 people. We had 18 the first Sunday I was there, and we swelled to about 30 after 3 years of my hard work. And whenever they'd have special holy days, like, I don't know, they had different kinds, but certainly Palm Sunday and Easter and stuff like that, we were right across the street from one of the largest Episcopalian churches in Kansas City, right? And so
Yeah.
on those days, they would use our parking lot because, they had tons of people coming on those special days, didn't have anybody. And I'm looking out there and I see all these Episcopalians showing up, and, and besides that, the pastor gets to wear really cool robes and things like that. And I would say, here I am.
You should have shown up in your academic regalia the next Sunday.
Here I am in my slacks and my sweater trying to talk to 30 older people, and there he is across the street in that great regalia, and there's huge crowds and they can't park anywhere. Even comparing yourself to the Anglican church across the street was not a positive thing. It was like, how, why not me, Lord? Why? And whenever you ask that question, it's the wrong question to ask. And so, but
Oh
boy,
gosh.
comparisons. I'm not just comparing yourself to other people of your denominational tribe, but just anybody out there, and say, man, why are we? How can he have 500 people and I have 30? What's going on here? What am I doing wrong? And that kind of thing. And look, it can be a fear that I don't want to deal with that.
Well, you're sending me down a rabbit trail with the earlier statement, your political statement about Eisenhower. See, I've heard you talk about Truman
Yeah.
quite a bit. Truman and Eisenhower had a unique relationship, two different parties. Truman, of course, succeeded Roosevelt after Roosevelt's death, and uh, Truman had the honor of being a part of the end of World War II, the difficult decision of the atomic bomb, and all of those things. But Eisenhower walks into his office one time, and Eisenhower's still a general, but a Republican walking into the Democrats' office, and Truman said, "You're more popular than I am. If you decide to run, I'm not going to run again." He said, "Mr. President, I'm not going to run while you are still in office." And so Truman then ran his first election as president. Of course, beat Dewey in the famous Truman beats Dewey, and then along comes Eisenhower as the next president, and just is he's almost godlike at that point. Eisenhower is,
Yeah.
and Truman's still the old folksy guy. But I think people remember Truman more than they remember Eisenhower historically, I should
Yeah,
say.
historically they do, and historically, certainly Truman has been listed way above Eisenhower in terms of presidential greatness for reasons that don't bear going into at this point. But no, absolutely, you're spot on. And I was born in the last few months of the Eisenhower administration, but my dad was a World War II veteran, and we knowing growing up in Kansas City, Independence, where Truman was, my dad was always telling us that, boy, when at the end of Truman's term, Eisenhower was coming in and people were done with Truman. I mean, he'd fired MacArthur and they were done with him. And he was
Yes.
yesterday's news and he was very unpopular. And here's Eisenhower, the great war leader. And it was just like incredible difference. And now you're right, the tables has turned. There may be a message there, maybe if we stretch it a little bit for what we're talking about here.
Maybe if you do what's God honoring, at some point you'll realize that it was all worth it.
But
Maybe
maybe not in
Truman.
your lifetime. Never.
Yes.
Truman died in the early '70s, and he was somewhat thought of better by that time, but not really like he is now. It's only been later as people have had the chance to look back and see what he did. And I say that all the time. I think that's true. You don't know right now what you're doing in that dying, declining church. You don't know how God's going to use that for his glory and your purpose for eternity. And so the story is not completed yet.
Well, to show my age, my first memory of a presidential election, now I was a small child, but my first memory was Nixon and Kennedy. So,
Really?
yes,
You
yes,
are
I
old.
was. Well, I'm old, but I have a lot of political memories. I wasn't even in school at
How
that
old were
time.
you? Like
Well,
three? What was the deal?
let's see. It was five, I think. I think that was 1960, if I recall correctly.
Yep.
So so I would have been, but I have vivid memories of it because Nixon was the hero to my parents were one of two Republican couples in the entire county. So it politics kind of stood out, and the thing about it, economically, Nixon proved to be leftward with his wage and price control. Kennedy proved to be conservative economically with his reduction of taxes. But that's another thing. I'm getting into politics too much. Overcoming the fear of failure, overcoming the fear of comparison. This last one is really, really poignant and powerful. Overcoming the fear of loneliness. Maybe it's not a fear going in. Sometimes it becomes a reality, even if it's not a fear.
Well, guys, do hear the story of going to a dying church and really feeling isolated and alone because you are isolated and alone. You oftentimes don't have that group of deacons or elders around you that love you and support you. They're sort of sometimes confronting you, and you're as I said before, if you're literally leading them through change, you're often leading it in a place they don't want to go because if they wanted to go there, they'd have been there before you got there. So let's just be frank about it. I mean, for the most part. And so you've got people that are somewhat hostile to your leadership. So you don't have that sometimes that warm, sweet fellowship of other people around you in the church. You probably don't have a staff. I mean, let's be honest, a paid staff. You may have a volunteer staff, but they may not even be with you. And unfortunately, Dr. Rayner, if your church is in decline and you don't have any real numbers to show and you're not baptizing people and you just don't necessarily always feel like showing up at regional network meetings and
That's true.
you don't feel like talking to people about it, and so you become even more isolated just at a time when you need to hang out with people and you need to have input from other brothers and sisters in Christ who are in the same kind of work, or you just don't want to be with people because you don't want to acknowledge, hey, we're actually down in attendance and no, we haven't baptized anybody and people are leaving our church and the building looks awful and I've been there for 3 years. I mean, I was there. I mean, I told you I was at Warnell for 3 years and we grew to about 30 or 40. I didn't really want to go around talking about that. It was, and that speaks to it. It does. I mean, as a point of confession, it speaks to my pride. I agree with that, and that's wrong. But it's also just the reality of who we are. And so when we often need to be with people, we withdraw. And so there is that fear of I'm going to be cut off. I'm going to be alone. Nobody wants to be with someone who's not growing, not doing well, and I'm going to be all out there by myself. And look, you are going to be for a while. There's no two ways about it. You are. It is a lonely path in many ways. That's why we try to have so many cohorts in this podcast and everything else to encourage folks who are in this work that you're really not alone. You may seem like you're alone, but you're not alone.
So I was on Church Answer Central, which is our forum, Mark, and um, I've heard this comment on more than one occasion or something similar to it. He said, I could not make it in my revitalization if it weren't for Revitalize and Replant. He said,
Really?
you've taught me that I am sane with some of my feelings. And the comments that followed, I mean, sometimes, you and I are doing these podcasts and we're enjoying the company of one another, and Amy, who you don't see, but nevertheless is here, as well as Akeem. And we don't, we're wondering, are people listening? Yeah, they are. And that helps their loneliness. Now, you brought up another point before we close on this, and that's the whole issue of social media. The fear of failure, the fear of comparisons, and even the fear of loneliness is all exacerbated today because of social media. When I did my revitalization in southern Indiana with 7 people, I didn't have all of that social media to tell me that I was sucked compared to everybody else. I was naive enough to think we're doing just fine.
Yeah.
We weren't, but we were. I was naive to think that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's even tougher today.
It is.
But
It is.
we're going to continue the series. We may do a little bit of review on failure, comparisons, and loneliness, but we're going to be going to 3 more fears as we get to our next presentation of Revitalize and Replant. We're going to talk about the fear of inadequacy, the fear of conflict, and the fear of alignment, or perhaps a better way of saying it is the fear of misalignment. A better way of taking it. So thanks as always for being with Mark Clifton and me on Revitalize and Replant. I know that many of you are now watching us on YouTube. And by the way, hi, because now you can see us. That is our steadily growing channel, as well as the channel for podcasts and wherever your favorite podcasting app is. Continue to listen to the International Harvester of Great, Mark Clifton, the leader of renown, Kevin Ezell, and the other guy, Rayner.
By
And
the
we'll
way,
continue. Yes.
if for those of you who are watching on YouTube, and if you're not, now you're going to have to go to YouTube and watch. I'm wearing the Replant Hat 2.0. So we've had the same hat for about 4 years, and this is the new version, 2.0. And the guys up in Alaska were the first ones to receive it. They are now
Cool.
in the warehouse, and they're available. You can have your very own Replant Hat. International Harvester means Jesus is the International Harvester. He brings in the harvest, and we work for the harvester. Anyway, you can get one. You just got to go to this website, which is replanthats.com. And if you go there,
Replant hats. We're going to put that in the show notes.
there you go. But you got to wear it. You can't just, you got to wear it, and you got to, put it on social media so you can compare yourself to everybody else.
Hey, that's a good word.
And you can make guys who don't have a hat feel inadequate and lonely. That's what you can do.
I love it. I love it. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Akeem. And thank all of you listeners and viewers for joining us on Revitalize and Replant, where we're helping get churches healthier together.